Lockheed Martin ultimately holds the contract with the US government to make these F-35s, but they then subcontract out, and there's long chains of subcontractors going around. So the small to medium Australian enterprises are in that web of subcontractors that are all ultimately feeding up into this one big Lockheed Martin contract with the US government.
It's possible that they are trying to diversify their supply chains into the submarine. So like you've got the F-35, you've sold the F-35 globally to a number of allies, to the Netherlands, to Turkey, England. So they all have F-35, so they all have part of their supply chains to go with the F-35. It's possible that they're trying to do something similar with these big nuclear submarines as well.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is a ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories, and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right. Resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Lil Barto and Margie Pestorius. The conversation was centered around the relationship between weapons manufacturers in Australia and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I hope you'll find my conversation with Lil and Margie useful and productive. Enjoy.
The genocide in Gaza is going into its 21st month now. The Israeli war machine continues to engulf the besieged Gaza Strip with a dark blanket of horror, smoke, death, and destruction. This war machine is being constantly replenished by Israel's Western backers and allies, including this country. However, the military relationship between Australia and the State of Israel has always been shrouded with secrecy and, at times, blatant lies. Today, we will shed some lights on this relationship and try to expose these lies and some of the major players in and profiteers of the genocide in Gaza and those who are involved in this thriving armament industry based here on stolen land. This will help expose how deeply the Australian government is involved in aiding and abetting the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I am delighted today to be in conversation with Margie Pestorius and Lil Barto. Margie is one of the founders of Wage Peace. She has been involved in anti-military work since the first Gulf War, that is in 1990. In 2016, she walked into Pine Gap to oppose the use of Pine Gap as a military operation base for war crimes. Following a decade of pursuing the corrupt and dangerous US alliance, in 2017, she started considering a pivot to addressing the weapons industry, which at that time was just starting to ramp up. Welcome, Margie. Lil Barto has been organizing for 8 years across climate, anti-militarist, First Nations justice, and abolitionist movements. She believes in community-controlled everything as a means to disentangle ourselves from oppressive structures and build real liberation. When she is not stuffing potatoes into the exhaust pipes of the war machines, she enjoys gardening. Welcome, Lil, and really thank you both for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you so much for having us, Ahmed.
Great to be here.
Pleasure is all mine. So I want to dive straight away into the conversation. what is Australia's contribution to the global armaments supply chain? And to that end, what are the goals of our government and aspirations in that area? Goals to expand our, arms trade capabilities globally, especially given this new alliance with the US and Europe and AUKUS.
Thinking about the goals of the arms trade, you have to think of the explicit goals of the government and the secret goals of the capitalist society. So there's this sort of the dark and evil undercurrent and underbelly. And then there's a sort of a discourse that they put out that's a bit of a fake discourse. And then there's also a sort of a real discourse that you encounter as well. That's, it's not exactly dark, but it's in the light. It's a bit more transparent, right? So you've got to look at those three sets of goals, I think. And, the export industry was sort of launched with a great fanfare in 2017 by Malcolm Turnbull. But of course, it had been planned much earlier, since the late 90s, by Kim Beazley and a bunch of people. Basically, the executives of both governments were planning it all the way along. On the face of it, it's to build a super technological workforce in Australia that can pull Australian out of the dark ages and into the light of the new technological world. That's one of the sort of discourses. And instead of just funding universities, they decided that they would put the money through the weapons industry and then allow the weapons industry to lift Australians up out of our
manufacturing poverty.
That's right, the manufacturing poverty that we'd fallen into. And and one of the reasons they did it they said they did it through the weapons industry was because all other industries were tied by the World Trade Agreements they set up for themselves, saying you weren't allowed to subsidise any manufacturing ever, except the defence industry. So there was that sort of discourse sort of somewhere in the middle, which is a sort of, I think, semi-truthful discourse, right? But what happens in that is that allows the dark people, I mean, Lil could probably talk, so maybe you would like to talk about the dark goals of the industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, it should come to no surprise to any of us that ultimate goal of all of it is money and the profitability of the weapons industry. So, you've got, as Margie was kind of articulating, you've got like the industry actors who are looking to climb career ladders, profit maximize, etc., make their shareholders happy. And then you've got the state actors who are playing, I guess, in a lot of ways, a more complicated game of geopolitics. And obviously, we have a very, very close military relationship with the US. And the US likes that a lot because we happen to be geographically, basically, in Asia. And that's, also the reason that Pine Gap is so strategically important to them, is because it's in the Southern Hemisphere and we're an incredibly solid military ally to them that has been an ally forever. So we're like a Southern Hemisphere, Asia-Pacific outpost of Western imperialism. And that's why we're important to the US strategically.
But why is it important strategically? Is it because of the rise of China? Is that the main reason?
Definitely, that's a huge part of it. With Pine Gap specifically, it's that because Pine Gap relays signals all around the world. So they need to have at least one in the Southern Hemisphere to be able to cover the whole globe and ping a signal to anywhere. So for Pine Gap specifically, it's about that. Now, this is my theory. I think that the reason that we're so important to the US is because we not only friendly to them, but we have critical minerals that are needed to make the weapons. So if we're manufacturing weapons, then, and there was to be a conflict with China, or like between China and the US then has this essentially like unsinkable aircraft carrier in the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, i.e. this continent, where everything is in-house. Like if we develop our manufacturing industry, we can mine the minerals and refine them and make the weapons. Like if we can't do that now, but I think that that's what the US would like us to be able to do, because then they don't have to deal with supply chains across the Pacific Ocean in order to fight in a war in this region of the world. They'd be able to basically utilize all of our, because we're so intertwined. Like if there was to be, like the way I often say it is like, if there was to be a conflict with China, Australia's military would basically become a division of America's military. Like that's just what would happen.
Just talking about this rare material that are necessary for weapons, because I've been hearing about this a really crucial part of the F-35, important for opening that entrance for the bombs to be released. And it's only manufactured here in Australia. Is that one of the reasons as well?
No, that's those are made here in Brisbane. Oh, they're made in Melbourne, those bomb bay doors, the bay doors. I think Lil's talking about the future, that you'd get some sort of integrated manufacturing with mining and extraction in the future. At the moment, I think it's mostly about the transfer of money. And what you get by setting up an industry here is you get a transfer of money from the Australian Commonwealth, the Australian people and the tax base, directly into the coffers of the defence industries themselves.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have been clearer. That's what I think they would like to work towards. That's not what's happening now, because we don't really have the capacity to refine a lot of the mineral. Like, often we export raw ore and it's refined elsewhere, like usually in Asia somewhere, and then we buy it back for the manufacturing that we do have as finished metals.
So maybe we could focus on the current contribution, what's happening right now, and maybe from there we can project it, what could evolve, like the F-35 model of the AUKUS. So the AUKUS could be blown up into a larger model of the current F-35. So maybe we can start with the F-35.
So basically, a part of the US model is to spread their military industrial complex across vast electorates, so that each electorate becomes dependent in some way on the military industrial complex for its permanency. So what you see that this supply chain does, it's got different rationales, but one is that it's able to source different things in different places, and it does trade-offs with the local government, whether it's Turkey or Australia or wherever. They've got the F-35 supply chains, and they do trade-offs to say, well, you do this manufacturing, we'll help you set up, and then you sell it back to us or use it in your own F-35 program. But really what's happening is the money is being transferred from the Australian Commonwealth to the military industrial companies. On the face of it, they say that these are small to medium enterprises. They call them SMEs. But what we're finding is that a lot of them are not small, medium enterprises at all. They're part of very large conglomerates of military industrial complex, private equity companies and industrial manufacturing companies. So they come in, they'll start setting up, and then they'll buy the company. It'll move into the hands of a private equity company. And these are weapons interested or weapons dominated private equity companies that maybe just do steel manufacture or heat treatment or some element that's required for these supply chains.
Are these local manufacturers, or can you give us some examples as well? Are these local or, coming from overseas?
For an example, in Brisbane, we targeted Ferra, which is creating one element that only goes to the Israeli aeroplanes. Ferra is a steel manufacturer. It does very high quality steel, and it makes about 100 different aerospace parts, military parts, maybe 100 different types for a bunch of different companies, including the F-35 program for Lockheed Martin. And on the face of it, Ferra is a small factory in the suburbs of Brisbane. It's been there for about 20 or 25 years, maybe even 30 years. But what you find is that 5 years ago, it was bought up by AUKUS, which is a multinational private equity company that specialises in buying up aerospace manufacturing companies. So it's not a small to medium enterprise. Or is it? I don't know. I'm still wondering about these things because it's actually a private equity company. As we know, private equity companies do not have ethics positions, right? They are just in the habit of buying, selling, making as much money as they can for their massive sort of holdings.
I think maybe some helpful context to add at this point is in the industry globally, you've got the primes and then you've got everyone else. So the primes are 8 massive companies that totally dominate the industry globally. So your Boeings, your BAE Systems, your Lockheed Martins, Northrop Grumman, these kinds of players. People just colloquially call them the primes. And almost all of them are based in the US. Not all of them. Some like BAE is British, Thales is French. There's a couple of very large. And then obviously there's kind of Russia, China, and the US are each sort of their own center of gravity because people tend to like to buy their military hardware from their allies rather than from their enemies. So there's kind of the different sort of like allegiances in the world. It'll depend whether you're buying your military gear from a US-based company or a China-based company or a Russia-based company. So obviously we're in the US orbit in Australia, and all of Australian owned and started business, the majority of their business is going to be winning subcontracts from the primes. So Lockheed Martin ultimately holds the contract with the US government to make these F-35s, but they then subcontract out, and there's like long chains of like subcontractors going around. So the small to medium Australian enterprises are like in that web of subcontractors that are all ultimately feeding up into this one big Lockheed Martin contract with the US government.
So Lockheed Martin is just assembles the F-35 from all these subcontractors, kind of.
Pretty much. And from what we've been able to glean from, people who work in the weapons industry or have worked in the weapons industry who have been willing to like sort of anonymously speak to us, is that if you're an Australian manufacturer, your dream is to get bought by one of the primes. The idea is not that you will grow to be the size of Lockheed Martin. The idea is if you're good enough at what you do, someone will buy you, and then you're rich and you can go do something else.
So is that what AUKUS is trying to promote as well?
It's unclear about AUKUS, but it does seem like that's possible, that they are trying to diversify their supply chains into the submarine. So like you've got the F-35, you've sold the F-35 globally to a number of allies, to the Netherlands, to Turkey, England. So they all have F-35. So they all have part of their supply chains to go with the F-35. It's possible that they're trying to do something similar with these big nuclear submarines as well. But they don't talk about it in the same way, but it's possible that's what they're trying to do, because they talked about it in terms of building the submarines here, right, at one stage, and then starting to build part of the submarines here. But it seems to me one of the issues for the US is they have such massive contracts, maybe $500 billion worth of contracts on the go at any time, right? And they can't get enough engineers for the numbers of contracts and the amount of money coming. So they're behind all the time.
See, when you stop funding your schools and only fund the military, eventually you run out of engineers.
Or you might just have too many projects for the number of people you've got. You're funneling so much money in it. That's what I believe, that they've got so many projects, they can't possibly meet them. And so they're running behind, and they're starting to compete for engineers and compete for small, space in the engineering companies. So basically they have to build more in other places. And so they've chosen, Australia has agreed to be the place that builds on their behalf, because Australia is dependent on this jobs discourse. You have to have the jobs discourse to win an election. And so this sort of fills one of those sort of fake discursive gaps that the parliamentary system runs on.
Well, that's what the politicians get out of it, right? They get to say, we created all these jobs, and the company gets to build their factory.
It's one of the things, because there's a lot of things they get out of it as well. It's incredibly, the military industrial complex is incredibly generous to its own and incredibly extractive and harmful to everybody else.
What I'm hearing is the government is promoting this expansion of the armament industry in Australia, opening the gate wide open for foreign investments, all these well-known primes, that's how you refer to Lil, and especially for the US, given the context of AUKUS. Our government focuses a lot of funding in this area, but then on the academia, for example, or on other avenues, the funding is much limited in comparison. And so when we say that universities and academic establishments try to look for funding and they can't find anything, and then they resort to investments in weapons manufacturers and armament, is that the right designation or characterization of the whole thing?
Those elements are a little bit more separated out than that. But basically there has been a shift under AUKUS to develop departments that will provide engineers for submarines. That's one thing that's going on. Like there's, for example, at ANU, they hollowed out physics area. It had been the ANU physics department was really into renewables and was looking at renewables. And then they hollowed that out. They got rid of all the not all of the staff, but a lot of the staff and I suppose the institutes they had around renewables, it just stopped being available. And then once it was hollowed out, they then started to repack it with nuclear physics, for example. That's to provide
engineers. Some universities are introducing specifically a Bachelor of Nuclear Propulsion or or maybe a master's degree on top of a Bachelor of Physics or something like that, but very targeted for the AUKUS workforce. And that is actually transparently the discourse that they use around it. They will use the phrases like building the AUKUS workforce and things like that.
And there's about $50 billion a year being spent on this, but the money doesn't come in from the US. The money goes out from Australia. So the Australian government spends $50 billion a year on this development of the industry, which includes some of these projects which it itself commissions. The Department of Defence will commission this and it will commission that. And they say it's for defence purposes, but it's not for defence purposes. It's in order to set up these supply chains for the US. It's not really, we call it's not defence, it's capitalism. So they're not really making things that are good for the defence of Australia. They're making things that are good for the US military industrial complex. And you've got to always be careful.
Shareholders, right?
Shareholders. That it's not these are not defence activities. I mean, there's a few defence activities sort of shoved in as cover for this extraordinarily shift of money into the military industrial complex. But most of the money just is moving into the military industrial complex without defence outcomes.
Although separate to that, that's what the Australian state is doing to kind of inject, all of this money and STEM in general is almost being repurposed as if the military industrial complex owns it and it's only for that. There's no other reason you'd study STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. In addition to what the Australian state does, universities also do sometimes have memoranda of understanding or partnerships or whatever directly with these companies. And there's been excellent work going on across the continent with student groups and staff groups challenging their...
Yeah, I wanted to get into that because I want to see how we can connect this conversation to what's happening in Gaza in terms of the weapon manufacturers who operate here or owned by or operate locally here and how they connect to what their relationships are with Israeli weapons manufacturers and also what their investments are like in academia. And this is why I'm assuming that, when universities come look for funding for certain research, they can only, some of the most available, if you will, investors will be, or could be weapons manufacturer. And that's why we find, is that why we're finding a lot of universities finding it difficult to divest? We see all these student encampments around campuses. So if we can talk about these things as well.
So it's to do with the way the universities are structured. So the universities mostly they've got three sources of funding really. They've got the main government funding for students and international students paying. They've got these funds that they've built up over time, which provide for them to have a few extra little projects on the side. So they're not like the US universities. The US universities are very old and have huge funds that they invest to bring money in for the university, like independent money for the university. So they can set up an institute here, an institute there. It's not like in Australia. The funds in Australia are not that big. So divestment in Australia is it's not such a huge thing. It's a symbolic thing more than a meaningful thing because those projects are not necessarily funding that much. That money is not funding that much. It might be upkeeping, the cricket ground, or it might be putting a few new trees down the back. But it's not probably upkeeping the military industrial complex. Then there's a third source, which is I think Boeing in Queensland has maybe contributed $10 million. I don't know how long, but it's not a huge amount of money, right? But it's got an institute planted. And if you look at what they're doing, it's hard to see what they're doing. But what's important there is that they've put themselves right in the middle of the engineering department. And from that positioning, they're able to make other projects happen in Brisbane. it's more like a Trojan horse that they put. I don't know if that's a helpful metaphor, but the Trojan horse comes in, it pretends to be one thing, but it's actually another thing. So they have a, relatively small institute at the university, but it takes up an enormous amount of the intellectual capacity. And gradually in that, what you get is a bunch of engineering teachers who are all military, who will promote military activity. You end up with a militarized post-grad system, as they're wanting to feed them through the Boeing Institute. You've got the same thing, parallel thing going on for mining as well, but we're just not in that area, right? And it's probably much bigger, actually. And then from there, you get Boeing setting up in Brisbane, and then you get deals with the DoD in Brisbane with Boeing, and then you get the wing kits being designed and then sold from Ferra in Brisbane. And then from there, you get 1,500 staff, Boeing staff, in the city in Brisbane, designing and undergoing all sorts of Boeing projects, DoD projects, export projects, research projects, all happening from Boeing in Brisbane. So the university thing, it's a pointy edge, but it may not be that huge. Where the big money is, where it's coming directly from the government into the contractors. That's the big money. And we think that Boeing gets between 5 and 7 billion a year direct from the government for its 1,500 staff in at Brisbane.
And while you've brought up Trojan horses, Margie, I'll just maybe put out there for the listeners, if you are a university student, like I studied physics, so I feel like personally betrayed by my university and my faculty and everything. But if you are a university student and you're interested in engineering and science and those types of fields, their favourite Trojan horses are space and robots. If you see anything at your university that has something to do with space or robots, you want to look at who funds it. Who funds it, because it's almost definitely the military. They're the people with money for space and robots.
In first year, they're for whales and agriculture, and in second year, they're for killing people. What we have is thousands of engineering students starting at 18 years old, coming to university, who have signed up for something that they said they look in all the advertising for 16 and 17-year-olds. Engineering is ethical, exciting. It's the new frontier for solving problems of the world. And by second year, they've been pipelined into the military-industrial complex via their courses at the universities.
Yeah.
But just, I want to pick your brain on this little, and then I'll come to you, Margie. Direct question. Why do you think it has been difficult for universities to respond to students' encampments in divesting from complicity in genocide? Can we also point out how does that complicity look like? Because we hear from our Prime Minister that, that conflict is too far away from us.
Yeah.
We're not a major player.
Yeah.
So how true is that?
I think in the grand scheme of things, it is true that Australia is not a major player in the sense that we're not one of the most, it's all about the relationship between the US and the Israeli state. However, I think that there are strong Zionist voices in universities often. And so while there has been impressive organizing efforts on the side of Palestine, Zionists are also organized.
So it's not about the money and the investment. It's not just about the money and investment, and it also partly because of these Zionist elements in the university. Do you agree with that, Margie?
Well, in terms of divestment, I don't know. I wasn't part of that sort of negotiations. So they did have negotiations, and there was a point where some of the communities had leverage over those negotiations. I think in terms of the divestment from weapons, it's quite small, and it's often embedded in other large funds. So it might be a tiny proportion of another fund, which is a proportion of another fund, which is a proportion of another fund. So they actually can't find it or get at it, and divesting from those funds is quite complicated. So it might be that they don't even have direct divestments with weapons companies. They might not have direct investments in these funds, because these funds are they're small adjunct funds. The question is more about the partnerships. A much more significant influence. And you can see the partnerships much more influential, and they're much more embedded.
What did you
So,
mean by partnership? Can you just explain what that is?
well, for example, the Vice Chancellor of Sydney University for a long time, I don't know if she still is, was the president of Thales. So you get this, so
The
you get
chair,
this
sorry, the
chair
chair of Talis.
of Thales. So you get these, there's a set of people who are directors of one of the weapons companies, and they are also on the boards of the universities. There's this sort of crossover, and they're there for a purpose. They're not there like, oh, I just do this as my second job. They bring the work of the weapons company into the university. They're there in order to develop partnerships. And so what I mean by partnerships is different types of research institutes, research projects. There's all sorts of things going on, and a lot of it's hidden. You can't actually see it. It's not like transparent. It's actually I think each of the universities have a whole hidden set of research that is privately funded that you can't even see. It's happening behind closed doors. Like in Brisbane, it's called the University of Queensland Corporation or something like that. And it's like a whole parallel structure to the university itself, like a parallel private structure. But they have workers. Like we found a worker in the middle of it, this woman, I can't remember her name. What she does is she organizes partnerships and research opportunities between the weapons companies, the military industrial and university academics. And she brings people in, she brings them together, and she's a people person. She wrangles projects, a matchmaker. And so she works for the university. She works for Boeing. She's the deputy director of the hypersonic missile project or something. And she's got a secondary job, which is matchmaker between project facilitator. Yeah. And she actually at some stage worked as intelligence for the government. And, so it's potentially she's still doing that. Who would know? And then she also she's looking at the discourse. She's working at the level even of discourse. So making sure that people are writing books about a war with China and what that would look like and how we need more weapons for that. And she brings those people into the university to give lectures on that and be an adjunct professor. And so it's not just at the scientific research level, it's also at the discourse level, the manipulating the society level.
Manufacturing the consent for it, right?
Manufacturing the consent for these genocides and for the sale of weapons into genocide. Their profit margins depend on genocide. They're not making enough money unless they have a genocide every now and then to use their weapons, to move everything along. It's incredibly evil, I have to say.
And incredibly opaque as well, because what Margie was just speaking to with, she's not the Chancellor anymore, but her name was Belinda
Hutchinson.
Hutchinson, thank you. Some students who sort of clocked that she was also, the chair of this multinational weapons company, requested the memorandum of understanding between the University of Sydney and Thales, and I can't remember if they wouldn't give it to them at all or if they gave it to them so redacted with 80% of the words in it redacted. Students at the university were not able to access the information on what precisely the partnership consisted of.
So it's still shrouded of secrecy and very opaque, like you mentioned.
This is probably the most opaque industry in the world because every time the public wants to know something, the government can just go, oh, no, national security, we can't tell you.
Or commercial in confidence. They just use commercial in confidence. And we only know about that woman that I was describing because we went and protested and interrupted a lecture that General Mick Ryan was giving, and she was there as his minder. So we're like, oh my God, there's the woman from the university. Oh, he's an adjunct professor at the university, and he's a total propagandist.
It's incredible. I'm really interested in bringing the conversation back to how these prime weapons manufacturers and their elements here in Australia, are they involved directly to the genocide in Gaza, either in direct relationship with, Elbit Systems, Rafael, and other Israeli weapons manufacturers, or in terms of other university connections with these weapon manufacturers here in Australia.
I think the first thing to remember is that Australia, again, has a very small percentage, and our biggest contribution is through the way we stand with the US, unapologetically the US. That's quite well known in the academic circle, because that's the role we play, right? But having said that, I did make some categories. So, there's the direct sale category, but what's also very important is this category where we shift things to the US and the US shift them to Israel, which is not a direct move, but it's a one removed rule. And under the arms trade treaty, you're not supposed to do that either. Under genocide, you're supposed to be shifting anything in the direction of the genocidal party.
That is still considered, aiding and abetting genocide.
I'd love to touch on, because, you've brought up our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, have been saying the whole time when they've been called out for this, they've been saying, we don't sell weapons to Israel. We don't sell weapons to Israel. We don't sell weapons to Israel. That may be technically true, because when you export any defense goods or what they call dual use, which will be like, a part that can go in a commercial plane or it can go in a computer chip or something like that has like a military application and something else. So anything that's defense or dual use, in order to export it from Australia, you have to apply for a defense export permit. And there are categories of those permits which you can get information about that, but you won't. It's very, very difficult to get what specifically was this permit for. And you'll never get down to the level of like, it was for, 20,000 of X kind of part for X kind of plane. You'll never get down to that level of detail, but they do have categories. So David Shoebridge, the New South Wales Greens senator, his office requested a bunch of information through question time and various other mechanisms available to him as a sitting parliamentarian to ask for all of the export permits that were granted to Israel in the last 6 years. And he did that about a year ago, so it would be 7 years now. And most of them were in the category of munitions, which is a different category to weapons. So when they're saying, we didn't sell them the gun, we just sold them the bullets for the gun. So when they're saying we don't export weapons, most of what Australia exports just in general is components. We make very few finished things, which ties into Margie's point about how we're often exporting a part to the US or to Germany, where it then is assembled into the finished product that is then sold on to the Israeli state.
Or it's replacing something that has been used. So early in the genocide and in the Ukraine war, they used a lot of equipment very quickly, which is one of the problems with having the two at once, which they were a bit sort of unorganized around. And so what that meant was that they have stockpiles to replenish. So it's possible they use their own, but they're trying to use Australian material to replenish stockpiles. This is what's happening with the bombs, where they used way too many bombs in those first 2 years of Ukraine and then in Palestine. And so they're trying to get as many bombs replenished as they can in Germany, especially, but also in the US. So there's a big transfer of 155 millimeter shells to both those countries. So that's another category. There's another category, which is SMEs, which are connected to the F-35. So as Lil said before, you've got the F-35 network of supply chain, but then you've got a lot of other SMEs. Maybe you've got other smaller ones feeding those ones. You've also got, so you've got the two or three direct that we know about, which is Bisalloy, which is providing steel for armoured vehicles, probably for Jeeps, also for the tanks that are being made in Brisbane and then being sent to Germany. And then from Germany, they could easily be being sent to Israel. So the EOS, swivelly killing machines, things.
Turrets. It's a turret, I think is what it's called. Yeah.
Called the turrets. The EOS.
So it's like a unit that you can put on a vehicle and then you mount guns onto it and it swivels on the...
It's possible they're going direct. There's drone transponders. It's possible they're going direct as well. But it's hard to know, but we know there's a set of things going via Germany. There's a set going by US. And then there's other sort of deals with Elbit and Rafael, which may or may not be creating things now, but they're sort of for future arrangements.
So Thales has joint venture with Elbit, and Thales, as I said, is a French company and it's huge, but it has manufacturing facilities in Australia. The Victorian government also directly had some contract with Elbit that I forget what the details of were.
Those things are not operationalised yet.
So they're like laying the groundwork for like future.
And the Bisalloy company that you mentioned, Margie, I think they're based in Wollongong, and we do have an ongoing picket
Mm.
A lot of activists are installing
Yeah.
that picket
Shout out to
outside
the
Spain.
Wollongong crew.
Yes, yeah, shout out to those picketers out
Yeah,
there.
it's as I've said this to them, but I identified Bisaloy in about 2019 when I first sort of started to make maps of what was going on as because it was making, you could see that it was beefing up to make steel with Rheinmetall, and I never imagined that people would take it on in Wollongong at that stage, you know. I had no
Rheinmetall
idea.
is the German manufacturer that is also providing some sort of weaponry to Israel. Is that right? Or what's the connection?
It provides engines, and it's got different partnerships with Israel. I think Germany, including Rheinmetall, is providing about 30% of equipment going into Israel. So Rheinmetall have a certain percentage of that. I can't remember what exactly, but certainly they transferred a lot of it looks like they transferred a lot of their 155 millimeter shells to Ukraine, and that freed up US shells to be transported to Israel. So it's good to think about it as being NATO, really, and the transfer of weapons into NATO, and then they get sort of rearranged and then sent out to the genocide, because that's pretty much how they work. And even there's been information coming out of Rheinmetall recently from an executive there saying, we don't really make the decisions here anymore. The decisions get made by BlackRock.
What's BlackRock?
BlackRock say it's probably the biggest capitalist sort of, I don't know how to describe it, Lil.
It's not a private equity firm, is it? But it's like that. It's like its whole thing is that it owns other things.
It owns like something like half of everything.
Of all the primes, if you will.
Of everything.
Of everything in the world.
Interesting.
BlackRock is this sort of ultimate capitalist entity that owns everything and makes decisions about everything else.
Yeah. It's like if you were going to design an evil corporation for a movie, it would be BlackRock.
That's the way to go. But I want to go to a couple of more questions. I want to talk about the complicity of current and former politicians in these weapon manufacturers, directly or indirectly. Can you speak to that, Lil or Margie?
So you go backwards in time, Lil, and I'll come up from the other end.
And you go back, you go forwards. Okay. Yeah. So the defense export strategy that Margie mentioned that was released in 2018, its top priority is to make Australia a top 10 weapons exporter in the world by 2028. And so that was introduced by the Liberal government, Malcolm Turnbull's government, but it has been upheld by every subsequent government. We've had Labor governments and Liberal governments since then. They've all stuck with that goal. The defence ministers, the number of defence ministers that go on to work for weapons company after they leave politics is insane. The revolving door between politics and the weapons industry is horrendous. So one example is, I don't know what time period he would have been the defence minister, maybe like 2012, somewhere around there. Brendan Nelson was our defence minister. He approved at the time a very controversial contract.
2008. Well, before Kevin 07, 2007.
Oh, true. It would have.
It's the Liberal government before 2007.
So anyway, he approved a really, really controversial contract to buy 6, I believe they were Hornets, which are like a type of fighter plane from Boeing, for $6.6 billion. And even the head of the Air Force, of the Air Force, was going on TV and being like, we don't need these. Use that money for something else. This is a stupid purchase. Don't buy these. The government did it anyway, bought them, and then immediately there's like a mandated cooling off period before you can go work for a government contractor after you leave politics. The second that was up, he was the president of Boeing Australia, and now he's the president of Boeing globally. So being the defense minister, if you look at the whole arc of Brendan Nelson's life, it was basically a rung on the ladder to be this corporate executive.
Well, he's not the only one. It's also Chris Pine was the same. It's also
Chris Pine is a great example.
Well, also Kim Beazley became, and it's also connected to being an ambassador too. So role is between the defense minister, the ambassador, and like once you sort of understand how government work, you realize this is how it works if you're in the wheat minister as well. You know, if you're agricultural minister and you do deals on wheat. Well, if you're the defense minister, you do deals. Basically, you're the weapon. You think you're about defense, but you're not. You're really about arms trading. And that's the main thing they do is arms trading. And so you got to keep your eye on the defense minister's what deals they make, where they go, how they organise, and how they cooperate with the UK ambassador and the US ambassador, because that's where the deals are getting made. So that's where the AUKUS is happening right now, is through the high level operatives who are in the Morrison government, basically. So Malcolm Turnbull's an unusual sort of he's on the edge, sort of critiquing all of this, but apparently his company owns part of Biss Alloys, so you just got to watch out for who's who. But Christopher Pyne is actually the architect of the modern system, and he's right in the middle of the modern system, still making stuff happen. But he's more interested in, he's actually quite committed to the development of the Australian industry for Australian defence, which is, you don't want to tell people too much that. But while he's doing that, he's also greasing the environment for all the other up-and-coming.
So Christopher Pyne's like a beautiful, like archetypal example who was the defence minister, after leaving, started a defence lobbying firm and is now a lobbyist for the defence industry. So, and the defence,
he's still designing it. He was the designer, and now he's operationalizing the design, basically.
Interesting. Okay, I want to shift gear. I want to ask my last big question. There are a couple of more smaller questions afterwards. Yeah. Pine Gap. You mentioned Pine Gap, Margie. Can you just tell the listeners and the viewers what is Pine Gap and how much do we know about it now? I mean, is it also shrouded in secrecy, what's happening in there? And more importantly, how involved is this facility in the current genocide in Gaza?
Pine Gap's a military base, basically. It's a US military base. It was positioned in the heart of Australia because it's cloudless. For 40 or 50 years, it was quite important for warfighting, collect signals. It became more and more of an operational base because it collects signals and it collects images, and then it needs people to sort of process the images and then put them out to other operational sort of bases in its warfighting scenarios. So it's a bit like supply chains. It's all decentralized, right? So is the US data gathering and operationalization. Their military is decentralized. So they don't have to have them all in one war room anymore. They can have them in spread out war rooms. So each of the war rooms becomes part of the operationalization of the war, right? It certainly collects a lot of data there, but it's also a military operations base as well. And that's what I think is most interesting about it. I mean, surveillance is one thing, but military operations is another thing. And it's probably moving against, it's probably very involved in war crimes and has been for 10 years, maybe 30 years.
Yeah.
Right.
And in terms of connecting it to Gaza more specifically, again, so opaque, so shrouded in secrecy, you would never be able to say, yes, workers that work in Pine Gap were helping with this particular strike that happened on this day. You'd never have that level of visibility over what's happening. But from what we know about what Pine Gap is for and how it normally interacts with the US war machine, the most likely way that it would be directly involved in the genocide in Gaza would be it's controlling drones or things, either intelligence is being passed through it in going and being sent to whoever can action that intelligence.
They collect images, they then check the images, and then they pass that information on. It's more than intelligence. It's like, it's like you send out a scout to see what's going on. The scout comes back and says, this is going on. And then you decide what you're going to do. It's that type of, like interactive warfighting. But it's, one thing we know about Pine Gap is that it's less necessary than it used to be, because they can use satellites now to do some of the work that they used to have to do because it was positioned in the south in a particular spot. So, however, they are building more and more satellites. They're more and more receivers, whatever they call them, these receiving stations. They're building more and more. I think they've got 30 or 50 there now, these massive antennas. Usually they have about 400 people working there, analysts working there. And those analysts are working on military operations. So I think you can't underestimate how important it is in all US warfighting. It's definitely used. There's a lot of evidence it's used. There's a lot of academics who have studied what the antennas are, where they're faced, what they're doing, and they can tell by the situation of the antennas what they're working on and what they're for.
Lastly, we've talked about many things, and we couldn't really delve deeper into every single thing, like Pine Gap and the primes and the locations and here and there. Where can the audience find more details? What are the resources available to us? Is there any details of how connected the weapons manufacturers here in Australia to the genocide in Gaza?
I think Declassified Australia is at the moment our major source of information. They have a set of articles there. Anthony Lowenstein is part of, that organisation. And if you go there, they've got the best referenced material. But then we use their material to make a map. And so our map is based on other people's research. So the other research that we used was an article by Michelle Fay that had come out early on about the F-35 supply line that had came out very early on in 2023. But Declassified Australia has updated that to some extent with more information and references. Our website then tries to also talk about what people are doing about those things so that you don't just turn up, start something new. You might run into another activist group while you're there if you don't check that somebody else is doing something. And then we suggest that you use, we've also got a podcast, which is called, what's it called, Lil?
What's it called? Get Your Armies Off Our Bodies. That's what it's called.
Get Your Armies Off Our Bodies. It's a peace pod, and it's like an introduction to militarism in Australia. So that's a good, if you found this a bit too much of a deep dive, you can go back to there and have a bit of a listen because it covers some of the ground that we've covered today.
Again, what is it called, the podcast?
Get Your Armies Off Our Bodies. It's on the Wage Peace Spotify, or you can get it through Podbean. It's also called Peace Pod, we sometimes call it. It's a Wage Peace podcast. You can check our Instagram, Disrupt Wars, which has just, it'll anything that's happening, if you keep an eye on that, you'll see anything that's happening week to week by actionists on the ground. Yeah, they're the main sources. Any more, Lil?
I mean, obviously the BDS website, BDS Australia, great information on, not really on the weapons industry, but in just general, they've done a lot more work on the sort of tech side of things like HP and these sorts of companies and their complicity. There's definitely like an overlap between tech and like Microsoft works with big weapons companies all the time and stuff like that. So
like cybersecurity
exactly
organizations, yeah.
Totally.
And I think you mentioned, Margie, the Anthony Lowenstein book and documentaries as well. They talk a lot about the cybersecurity, the control systems that Israel uses and actually exports to the world.
That's right. And training, the Israelis do a lot of police training and militarizing the police. So there's a big movement across the world to lift the police training up to a militarized police standard. Sort of police start off being sort of a bit illiterate and feckless, but they, over time they get lifted up so that they've all got military training. And you can see that in Los Angeles at the moment. They're using the same sort of tactics that they used last year on us at Disrupt Land Forces. They're all trained by the same people.
Yes, yeah. I do have one last question, if we can touch on it. Do we know any kind of influence of the Zionist lobby and the media? Do we have any relationship with weapons manufacturers? Do we know anything about that?
The greatest strengths of the peace movement has been the independent journalists. We have Peter Crono. He did used to work for the ABC. He did a fantastic show on Pine Gap in 2016, 2017. He works with Lowenstein now, and he's a critique of the ABC, critiquer. But we have Michael West, we have Yaakov Aharon doing some really interesting, looking at the Zionist sort of influence in the weapons trade. He was the one who identified Bisalloy's connection to Turnbull's companies. We've just got some fantastic researchers there.
Is there anything else that you want to add the last minute, Margie and Lil?
When the genocide, this round of it sort of kicked off, we did have a lot of people come to us at Wedge Peace and be like, where is X thing made? Or what does this factory do? And stuff like that. And the advice that I find myself giving to people a lot of the time is, to my mind, any company that's doing business with companies that are directly supplying this genocide is a valid target for protest. And if you wait around until you have the level of information, like people want to be, understandably, like I also want to be sure that I'm targeting a valid target before I act. Like that's a good thing to be cautious about. But if you want the level of detail of like, yeah, we're going to stop this truck that's carrying this many of this type of machine gun to the port of Brisbane where it's going to get exported directly to Tel Aviv, you will never have that level of detail. Don't wait to have that level of detail because you'll die waiting. So if you've identified a company and you know that it's connected in some way, just make noise about it.
Because these companies and organizations, they know that they're doing something wrong, and they're
They
very
know.
active about how they release data and information.
It's not true that they hide things either. If you just go researching properly, you can find all sorts of stuff. Like they are quite proud with what they do, and they do pretend it's part of a legitimate business. And people say, how do you find this stuff out? And you go, oh, we just read some magazines. It's everywhere in plain sight. It's just that we're not great researchers, but we got a lot of good researchers coming along, and there's a lot of great research going on, but you can go find stuff if you want. And I guess what I would say to people is that
another great place to get information is investor reports. So because these, with the bigger ones that are publicly listed, they have to pitch themselves to investors, right? So they have to brag about what they do. And you can sometimes find online like transcripts of the speech that one of the directors will have given to a room full of investors and stuff like that. And that can be a really good place to find information about what the companies are actually doing.
But I think for me, it's that a lot of people have come in the movement in the last 2 years since the genocide started. And a lot of us are at the beginning of a journey to think strategically about how we address these things. The BDS offers us an intellectual framework, and I think we should really find ways of sitting inside their intellectual framework, because they will back projects that are inside that intellectual framework. But we also need to each step up and become an independent strategic thinker and independent strategic organizer, because this is not the last genocide. It's not the last thing the Palestinians are going to face. It's not the last thing that the West Papuans are going to face. And that each of us need to understand how our governments collude with business and collude with capital to organise big death projects that create death, that are very destructive. And we need to be all looking at how we develop our strategic thinking. So it's not enough to know these things are happening, and it's not enough to know a lot more about them and know the details, right down to the very little detail that we need to know. This is not what we need. What we need is to know how we act together strategically and how we try things and make things happen. That's what we need to learn. And if you've only been in the movement 2 years, you're at the beginning of that journey. You need to know that there's a lot that you can learn from the great minds that have come before, that now that you've been here for 2 years, you will have good foundation for learning a lot more about how we create strategy together and collaborate and make things happen.
Well said, Margie. And I think on that note, I really want to thank you, Margie and Lil, for your precious time and the wealth of information and insight that you provided us.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.